Hello 6450. Before I get started, I want to apologize that I'm screencasting from home. It invariably means that you will be interrupted by an animal. If it's too much of a cacophony, I will pause the screencast and then I will resume recording. Just fair warning that I am doing this from home, and with the cats and the dogs here, it could get a little bit crazy. So I am so sorry. We've had conferences on Wednesday and Thursday since the beginning of time in my building. We've always used a document in our bulletin called Year at a Glance. And this was only recently uploaded this year. I'm not sure why it took so long for it to be uploaded. And you can imagine the incredulousness that I had when I read that conferences for fall would be on Tuesday and Wednesday. Just a completely bizarre and unforeseen thing. So honestly, thank you for your patience and participating in watching this screencast. You also will have seminar tonight, but it won't be in the form that we usually use since we're not in the room together. It'll be a threaded discussion, and I'll show you where that'll be in Canvas at the end of this screencast. So please spend some time thinking about the case. I've posted some questions up there for you to consider, but you can really write about anything, as we do with seminar when we're together. I just wanted to have some things to launch it in the event that it's a little hard to do from a threaded discussion since we do seminars together. I hope you read all of the questions. I'll read them aloud too, but I hope you'll also consider them. Just make sure that before the 22nd at 5 o'clock that you do make a post regarding this Rosenfield chapter that we'll use for seminar tonight. These screencasts will be uploaded in 15-minute increments, so we'll take small pauses in between. Tonight, we'll be revisiting the systems thinking that we began when we first discussed Kurt Lewin. You'll remember our discussion of force field analysis. We'll continue this discussion of systems thinking. We'll also be thinking more about parameters that exist within an individual organization. We'll go over both organizational consultation and collaboration. And we'll talk about one school-based movement that is very common in Colorado and taking root, I think, across the country. As you know, I'm a youth mental health first aid trainer, as is Michael, and a lot of the webinars that have been coming out for those of us who are trainers of youth mental health first aid consider this notion of trauma-informed practices and trauma-sensitive practices, and it's really common in Colorado. So that will be the school-based movement that we detail a bit tonight when we're discussing organizational consultation. I'll also show you where you're going to complete the seminar tonight, and I'll look forward to seeing you guys next on the 22nd when we're back in our face-to-face format. So change within an organization can sometimes take a view which is too streamlined. And when that happens, the consultant has the opportunity to miss a lot of possibilities. When targeting a change within a system, it's important to consider the subsystems that exist within that particular system. So let's hear a little more about how you can plan for scenarios that exist from our friend Rick Maurer.
Organizations start to think about a change. This is Rick. I'd like to talk a little bit about scenario planning. When people in an organization start to think about a change, they think about a change. They look at a particular problem or a particular opportunity, they identify where they want to go, and then they start planning toward it. And that's, in some ways, as it should be. The problem is, that can narrow the focus too much. It's almost as if they get on the cycle and they make a compelling case for change. They do things to get started. They keep the change alive. Once it gets rolled out and they start to see results, they protect that so it becomes part of the institution and part of their culture. That all makes sense. The problem, though, is that sometimes those blinders can be on so tight that all we can see is the direction we're headed, and we miss the overall context. So, if conditions change, the marketplace changes, demographics change, there's a change in political leadership, or there's even a hint of that on the horizon, we miss it because we're putting all of our energy into the direction we're already going. Here's where scenario planning can be very, very helpful. Scenario planning invites us to look at possible futures. What if this happened? What if that happened? Classic case of this was Royal Dutch Shell. In the early 70s, they were one of the world players in selling petroleum products, but they weren't anywhere near the top. And they did some scenario planning, and one of the scenarios is, what if the oil-controlling states start to restrict the flow of oil and therefore raise the price of crude oil? What will happen? And so they figured out a scenario for that, but they figured out other scenarios at the same time. Well, when OPEC started to feel muscle and started to control the flow of oil and prices started to shoot up, a lot of oil companies were surprised by that and didn't have a plan for it. A lot of auto manufacturers were surprised by that and were still pumping out these huge cars that got very bad mileage, and they all took a beating for that. Royal Dutch Shell pulled this plan off the shelf and started to use it. And they went from one of the players into one of the major players primarily because of that foresight. Now, they didn't have a crystal ball. They didn't know that was going to happen, but they considered a number of reasonable scenarios that could happen in the future, and that's what scenario planning is. Scenario planning is less about the technique of it and more about the courage of it. It takes courage to look at things that might happen that we don't want to happen. Some of us just want to focus on what's positive, what could happen. Wow, if we're successful with this change, look what will happen. How can I say this politely? That's stupid. We really need to take a broad range. We need to be willing to look at things like, will the levees hold? Do we have a good contingency plan for that? What if conditions change? And of course, many of those scenarios are never going to come true, and that's a good thing. But part of the positive process, in addition to having a scenario that you can pull off the shelf, is that you get people talking to each other and you get people thinking about the business, and that alone is a really good thing. If you're interested in learning more about this approach, I highly recommend the book The Art of the Long View by Peter Schwartz. Very good book on scenario planning, and he gives a lot of details for the Royal Dutch Shell experience. Highly recommend the book.
All right. So within a system, it's not, I think a common misconception is you're thinking of the worst case scenario, but it's not that. It's just that within an individual system, in this case a school, since this is a consultation class for school-based mental health professionals, that it's dynamic and there will always be some manner of change because things are fluid, especially if you're a systems thinking. You'll remember when we discussed systems level thinking initially, I describe it as cogs, and as each of the cogs move, things within the system shift. As an example, apparently the demographics of my middle school have changed a whole bunch. Now I would say that we're probably, I don't even know the percentage, I'd hate to venture a guess, but I bet it's 50 to 60% in the 6th grade class that we have of students who are neighborhood students. So these are kids that mostly live in the Wash Park and Wash Park West area, in addition to some areas around DU. Historically, our building wasn't like that. Our building does have a newcomer program, people who are recent immigrants or who have refugee status in our school. And then, as I've told you before, that around Colorado Boulevard, there are a lot of manner of apartments. Neighborhood students weren't really coming to our school. They were choicing into other buildings, they were going to private schools, and now they're in our building. That causes climactic shift within the building that, frankly, has caused some teachers to even leave. And if you're thinking about change within an organization as an organizational consultant, and you're using the theory of Rick Maurer, this would be a scenario in which you would plan. You would think about, what if we become a neighborhood school? What are some scenarios that we need to think out in case they do happen? Because as he said, it's really ignorant of you. I think he said it was stupid, but I'll say it's really ignorant of you when you're disrupting things within a system and employing some sort of consultation strategy or intervention to not think through scenarios that could alter the landscape, that could change things up, that could bring about a Ouroboros effect, like an unintended consequence. So that's why scenario planning is something that's really important for consultants who are using an organizational format to consider. So what does it mean to be a systems thinker? We've talked about that just a little bit in a previous class where, like I said, we were discussing Kurt Lewin. What does that mean if a consultant is a systems thinker? And what does it also mean for a consultant to work within a system? A given school district, a state department for education, an individual building, a section of buildings. My high school is in the far northeast. What does it mean to incept a change as a consultant in buildings in the far northeast area of Denver? What does that mean for that consultant who could be hired to work in that system? And frankly, what parts of the system have to be considered before you adopt a specific consultation intervention? Back away from the far northeast, back to my main building, this year we abolished the ability for students to bring in cell phones. If they do bring them in, they're to power them off and put them in their locker. If they're seen in our building, they go in an envelope, and the parent gets to pick them up, which has been kind of interesting. A parent came in after Labor Day weekend and said, well, I guess it's time for our walk of shame. We're going to reclaim his cell phone. Anyway, we don't have cell phones anymore. And I honestly think now that there's not that temptation and impulse to Snapchat in class, I think we can have higher expectations. But before we eliminated the cell phone policy, we had to think about pushback from parents who say, I want my kid to be safe in your school. From parents who want to talk to their kids, frankly, during the school day. There were a lot of things that we had to consider before we made the policy that we did within a school building, within that system. We also have abolished the use of Chromebooks during lunch or recess. And I can just tell you, as a person who's been in the lunchroom, this is going on my 3rd year, it's a lot louder. So that's kind of an unintended consequence of not zoning out on your one-to-one device using your Chromebook at lunch. But I think that these are just minor examples of some things that you consider when you're being a systems thinker. It means that you're thinking how changes and interventions which are employed disrupt the system and also change parts of the system. And you also want to consider all of those before you adopt any type of intervention. That's why I think that this notion purported by Maurer of scenario planning is critical. And it's an excellent thing for us to consider when we're talking about systems level thinking within a consultation.